Hi, I'm Eric Pratum. Welcome to the Unfolding Thought Podcast, the show for leaders and deep thinkers who demand more than the usual fluff. If you're the kind of person who moves on from a book, video, or podcast the moment it stops making you think or introducing you to something you can use, I hope you'll feel right at home here. In each episode, we uncover the deeper, often overlooked forces that shape our thoughts and behaviors so you can see yourself, your team, and the world from a whole new angle, and then actually apply what you learn to grow and do better. On the Unfolding Thought Podcast, we aim for minimal filler and maximum insight, challenging assumptions and sparking new thinking every step of the way. Are you ready to dive deeper? Then let's get started.
Today, I'm speaking with Alan Fine. I cannot tell you how lucky I felt that Alan said yes to speaking with me. As you'll hear in the recording, I first became aware of Alan because of Grow, read his book, which I felt was great, and then participated in training with his organization, Inside Out Development. I'm also such a fan of Grow that I recorded a short episode on it early in this podcast's history and will link to it in the show notes. Please check that out. It will take you less than 15 minutes to listen to and get an experience with Grow as a tool. For me personally, this is the most valuable and interesting conversation I have yet had on this podcast. And up to this point, I've had several that have been great. I hope you'll find this equally as valuable. And now, I bring you Alan Fine.
Alan, welcome. Can you tell me about yourself, please?
Sure. I guess my story as such goes way back to my childhood, where I was severely asthmatic as a child, wasn't able to play sports. My brother, when I was 11 years old, entered me in our school's tennis tournament. So I'd been on a tennis court 3 times in my life prior to that. And I found myself in the final against the school jock. It's like the school hormone freak. He's captain of the rugby team. He's over 6 foot tall. He's a gifted athlete. And I was 6'4", 4-love in the lead. And I can remember to this day where I stood on the court, a voice in my head went off and said, "My goodness, you've only got to win 2 more games and you'll be the school champion." And I froze, never won another game, but I got a lot of recognition from my friends at school. And up until that point, the only thing I'd been recognized for was always having a sick note to get out of doing any athletic activity. So my father arranged for me to join a local tennis club, and I was taken under the wing because I showed a little promise I was taken under the wing by the tennis coach there. She was just a local PE mistress. And in return for being allowed to play with the adults, it's a very British thing, this, I had to help her teach the little kids, the 6 and 7-year-olds. And that was my introduction to coaching. And it took off from there. By the time I was 16, I was assisting our national coach in the teaching of the younger kids. And I went on to qualify as what they used to call, it's a long time ago, a registered professional tennis coach. So that was all the training that you could do. I went to college to study optometry. I was teaching tennis to pay for my tuition. And I did so much of that. I'm not very proud of this. I was thrown out of college after 2 years for teaching too much tennis. So that's really how my career began. It was as a tennis coach in Wales. And I was fascinated by why some people perform better under pressure than others and why some people seem to learn faster than others. So I embarked on a layman's journey into sports psychology. Fascinating, loved the things I was learning, almost all of which was useless when you're trying to help 16-year-olds. Talking to them about the Yerkes-Dodson law of motivation isn't very interesting for them. And the thing that opened my eyes was I stumbled into a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And it was written by Timothy Gallwey way back in the 70s. It's still the best-selling tennis book of all time because it had so much application to everything that we do as human beings. And it was about the game that we play internally against ourselves as we try and play against our external opponents. And that showed me how to begin to apply some of the sports psychology I've been learning. And through a series of kind of recommendations, I ended up working with two members of our British Davis Cup team. One of them was our number one. He went from 90 to 19 in the world in 6 months. So I got a lot of publicity out of that. I was then approached by some golfers who played on the European professional circuit. Some of them did well. I got a lot of publicity out of that. I was asked to help out musicians, teachers, even dysfunctional children. I hate that term because I think it's part of the problem. And then some of the executives that I would try to help with their tennis and golf said, I think this would apply in my organization. And I'd learned by then not to say, oh, no, I'm just a tennis coach. So we talked about it. And here we are, gosh, how much later? 40 years later. And we've been doing educating leaders and managers and supervisors how to apply the core things that I'd learned in sports psychology all those years ago.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm curious, your brother entered you in this tennis tournament. What's your age difference?
4.5 years.
Okay.
First name is David. And when I went through school, so three years after him, all the teachers called me David.
Do you think he had any particular motivation for entering you in that tournament?
Other than I was painfully shy back then. And other than trying to help me kind of come out of myself, I think that's all it was doing. He was being a great big brother to me. That's the assumption I've made. Maybe I should go back and check with him.
Yeah, I'm really curious about, at the time, what he was thinking, because many of us, of course, have siblings. Some of us have very large age gaps. Others do not. I have a younger sister who's a year and a half younger than me, and we did a lot of the same activities, some of which I'm actually really interested to ask you about, because you and I share some similarities in our background. But just to keep on the sibling thing, my sister and I are fairly close in age and did a lot of the same activities, but still, I don't recall that we interacted much as children. That's not to say that maybe I wasn't looking out for her or her for me, but when you said that your brother entered you in the tournament, the question appeared in my mind of, I wonder what he was thinking.
We used to, up until about that age, actually, we used to hang out a lot. We used to play together. And my father had nicknamed us Get Off and Stop It, because that's all he would ever hear from us as we fought.
You know, I have here your book, You Already Know How to Be Great, which other people who have listened to me before know that I feel that this is one of the great books on coaching. It has, however, been a while since I read the book, but am I recalling correctly that you mention this story about the tennis tournament in there? I feel like I have heard this before, but I'm not sure where.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read it too.
I have no doubt. I think, was this published in, it was
2010.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. It's been a while. So there are some things that I want to get to, but you having mentioned teaching players that were younger, what was the structure like, or did you get support? Were you often one-on-one? What did that look like at the time?
Well, sometimes I feel like I've led a charmed life, because when I was about 13, 14. One of our local sports administrators, he virtually adopted me on weekends. So he would take me, if we weren't playing tennis, he would take me to the training of tennis coaches programs, and I would be the guinea pig that all these coaches would experiment on. So I had a unique insight into what effective tennis coaching was and wasn't at a very early age. It wasn't like just the experience for me, but I was sitting in on the discussion that the trainer of these coaches was having with them, the feedback he was giving them. So it was really an education for me vicariously about what coaching was about. Of course, at the same time, my father was a teacher, so there's an argument for there's some DNA around this as well.
I have no doubt that there were some perspectives, perhaps, on students or motivation or any number of other things that you picked up from your father.
Yeah, funnily enough, not that I remember, but that's why I say maybe it's in the DNA. I don't remember us talking about teaching at all.
I have no doubt that your philosophy of coaching and the tool sets that you might use or your colleagues might use have evolved over time. But one thing that I identify you for or with is grow. So would you mind telling me the definitive story, or I suppose some of the backstory of how grow came about?
I'm too old to argue what's definitive about anything in my memory now. But how I recall it is there were three of us exploring Galway's methodology from the inner game of tennis. And we ended up doing some work in McKinsey. So if you think about at its simplest level, Grow model is a great organizer for a questioning approach. And we were doing this, we were using it on a tennis court, on a ski slope with golfers. We had, I don't even remember how now, but we ended up doing this work in McKinsey with their engagement managers. And one of the things that would happen is it was usually me would get on the tennis court. We'd take them on a tennis court and we'd show them how just by using questions, you can increase somebody's performance on a tennis court. I mean, it's a very graphic, simple way to do that. And for us, it was just instinct. It was unconscious competence. And the first iteration that I can remember of Grow was when one of their communication specialists said, I think this is the pattern that you guys are using. And it was labeled Grow. Now, independently of that, some years later, and this was just after I moved to the US, I had a partner in Inside Out who independently had never heard of Grow, but came up with the same acronym, having watched what I was doing. So, and that's how the acronym was born. It was just people watching and saying, I guess, I don't mean to be arrogant when I say this, modeling competence at questioning. There's a pattern to it and there's a repeatable pattern to it.
With Grow, I suppose, for just so that anyone who is listening to this that maybe is not familiar with it, could you explain some of the philosophy behind it or, you mentioned a little bit about asking questions, kind of maybe how Grow differentiates itself from, I don't know, standard models of coaching, if I could use a phrase like that?
First of all, I should say, I don't see Grow as a model of coaching.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I see it as a tool for a coach to be using. And within the approach, my definition of coaching is a little different, I think, to some that are out there, in that I think coaching is where you're trying to help somebody perform at a higher level, which means that there's lots of tools we might draw on. And I make that distinction because I've had people say to me, coaching is only asking questions. And I think that would be a disservice and almost irresponsible on the part of a coach if I have some information, some knowledge that could be useful to somebody, to not share that knowledge. There needs to be a good reason why. And I think there are occasions why I wouldn't share that knowledge, which we can explore. But so I guess the first thing I'm suggesting is Grow's a great, powerful tool for guiding a questioning process. And behind the kind of behind that, in my mind, what we're looking at is, in order for people to perform, they've got to take action. In order for them to take action, they need to make a decision on what action they're going to take. If they don't make a decision, they're not going to take action. Grow fits right in there because Grow is a way to model or map the decision-making process. Because you start in reality, no choice about that. You set a goal about where you want to get to. You develop options that you think will take you from reality to the goal. And then you choose one or more of those options to take action on, and that's what I'm calling the way forward. So whether we are conscious and systematic about using Grow or not, when we make a decision, you can always map the decision to the stages of Grow. So everybody's already going through those stages. I argue the only choice they ever have is, are they systematic about it, or are they random about how they go through those stages? So buy a house, go see your doctor. If you buy a house, you're going through the stages. Your doctor will walk you through the stages of Grow as they do their diagnosis and recommendation. Consultants go through those stages because it's in a sense, it's a simple consulting process. So it's one of the tools to me that a coach would use, one amongst many that a coach would use. The power in it is that it seems to be at the heart of pretty much any performance improvement. There's a decision that's going to have to be made. And if we can help people own that decision and make a clearer, faster decision, that impacts performance.
By someone asking you the kinds of questions that you might ask to use Grow, as a tool, does that facilitate the person thinking or being systematic in their decision-making?
My argument is the core foundation of all human performance is the choice of what we pay attention to, the choice of what we focus on. If you don't get at that, then it's really hard to make anything different. So what happens when you ask somebody a question, then you cause them to pay attention to something in order to answer the question. So if I'm on a tennis court with a tennis player and I say, would you tell me whether the ball was rotating forwards or backwards when it got to you? In order to answer that question, they will watch the ball so carefully in order to know the answer. When I ask a question in the Grow model, what have you tried so far? It causes somebody to go back into their memory and list out the things that they've already tried, which is really useful for me as a coach because it tells me something about what they've explored. It might also tell me whether they executed that something well or not. And it tells me, it opens the door to what else might be put on the table to help them. So just asking the question reveals information all the time. Even if they said, I don't know, that in itself is information.
I recall you saying in one video or another, perhaps as some of my training, that Grow is a focusing tool. So we're drawing people's attention to something and hopefully enabling them to focus on that issue or that decision, as you're saying.
Yeah. The power of a focusing tool is so over the years, I've interviewed people about what it's like when they play well, what it's like when they play badly. And and I've interviewed world champions and absolute beginners, lots of different activities. They all say the same thing. When I play well, I don't think a lot about what I'm doing, and I don't have to use a lot of effort. So then I ask them, what's it like when you play badly? What do you typically do? And they say, well, after I've cursed, then I try and analyze what's going wrong. Then I try hard to fix it based on that analysis. And what it usually does to my performance is makes me worse. And then the worse I get, the more I analyze, the harder I try, and the harder I try, the worse I get. So then I ask them to take a deep breath and step back and think about what they said. They know that when they play well, they don't think a lot about what they're doing, the quiet mind, the zone, and they don't use a lot of effort. But the way they try and fix playing badly is by doing the opposite of what they know they do when they play well. They think more about it, they analyze, they tense up their muscles. And then I take the blame for why that happens, because we coaches, one of our most common instructions is to tell people, well, try harder. I would bet that you've done it out there with the kids' soccer. And I'd say this only half tongue in cheek. It's what we coaches do when we have no idea what to do next. So we use these, and parents do this all the time. And then the other thing that we do, something you mentioned earlier, I totally underestimated the power of my authority as a coach, where I would give advice to people and they turn it into a should. And you've probably heard about the tyranny of the shoulds. So now they're always trying hard to do it correctly. And Tim Galloway identified, I think it was 5 tryings in tennis, trying to hit the ball, trying to hit it over the net, trying to hit it straight, trying to hit it hard, trying to hit it correctly. All of which get us out of being in the zone.
So we've talked about Grow, and you also mentioned your organization. So it should be obvious to someone listening to this, because I've mentioned me getting training through your organization, that they can go there for Grow. But are there other things that your organization either trains or certifies people in, or other things that you do other than Grow?
There are other models that we use. And I think of all of them in a context of how do you help people do things better? So there's, you may remember from the book, there's a thing we call the performance wheel. And all of these models, by the way, by their nature, models are oversimplifications. But they're simplifications because we human beings, we need, our minds are pattern recognition systems, and we're looking for ways to organize and simplify because it makes it easier to take action. So the performance wheel identifies 4 critical components of getting performance. And I wouldn't argue they're the only ones, but these are the ones that over the years showed up to me most often. And so knowledge is obviously one component. If you don't even know what to do, it's a bit of a problem. But even when you know what to do, unless you deal with the 3 other components that we call focus, faith, and fire, then you won't be able to act on the knowledge. And so every parent, every leader has scratched their head on some occasion or other. wondering why, having given the advice they've given, people didn't do it. And they've had to tell them again and again. They had to repeat the same advice. And the point about that is, if knowledge was all we needed, we'd all read the book and we'd all be world champions. Yeah, I'd have read Tiger's golf book and I'd be playing on the PGA Tour. It doesn't work that way, because you also need to be able to control what you pay attention to. And that has a huge impact on your belief in yourself. So if what you pay attention to are the internal voices that says, don't screw up, you're not good enough, well, that detracts from performance. So you need to know how to pay attention, what voice to pay attention to, or how to quiet the voices. It would arguably an approach to mindfulness. And you need to know what to pay attention to increase fire, motivation, passion, commitment, that willingness to go the extra mile. And only when those four are kind of dialed in, if you like, that's when you're much more likely to get peak performance. So you can have really smart people not performing. You can have highly motivated people, but aren't able to perform. You can have folks who are both knowledgeable, motivated, but just doubt themselves all the time. Hey, and I'll put my hand up for that one. That was me. And even if you've got all three of those, if they don't have the basic knowledge, it's still going to be a problem. All four of the components are there. And this internal dialogue, we like to call it interference, gets in the way of choosing what we focus on. And if we manage what we focus on, we can reduce the interference and performance goes up, sometimes dramatically. And grow is just such an easy tool. I always describe myself as the village idiot. If it isn't simple, I'm not going to be able to use it. Grow is simple enough that even I can use it.
I feel like in the right circumstances, which for me is quite a lot of circumstances, that just falling back on a little bit of basic structure. Like you said, the person's going through this process already. And if I can help them to focus, and by helping them to focus and not trying to put something on them, think about it like this, do it like that. If I can also help to lower that interference so that that inner game that they're playing, the game that we play against ourselves, that is either not happening or that it's easier, then it really doesn't matter how simple or complicated the thing is. The person can get to hopefully their ultimate goal. And even if they don't, they can feel like they made all the right decisions at a bare minimum.
One of the things that shows up to me over the years is it doesn't matter what level you play the game at. Because every level, whether, let's say you're a professional golfer or a beginner golfer, both of them experience stress. And in order to deal with stress, it has to be simple, because under stress, our field of vision narrows, our hearing gets more selective. The noise in our mind goes up. We don't think as clearly. So asking somebody, that in order to get them to focus under stress, it's got to be really simple. And that's been a surprise for me. It's been validated over and over. Every time I go to work in a new field, I'm always wondering, what don't I know? But that shows up every time. On the other end of that scale is, this is a direct quote from this was the leader of an internal university in a consulting group, whose comment about grow was, it isn't intellectually rigorous enough for us. I'm not even sure what that means, but for me, it missed the point of, are we about performance or are we about, I'm not even sure what he meant, intellectual rigor?
Yes, there are, if I can make some assumptions about that statement, there are challenges selling certain things to clients if they don't think that you have some special magic that will be difficult to replicate. And for what it's worth, if I'm right in even some of these circumstances, and maybe not in that one, if I'm right in some of them, being effective is the special magic. Knowing how to, as you said, I think it was implied at the very least, and I know this because of your background, being able to go into golf, a sport in which I believe you were not an expert, and improve someone's performance, I think demonstrates that you do have some, as I'm terming it, special magic. Who cares if it is intellectually rigorous or seems magical?
Just as an aside, I have had the wives, as it happens, of a number of athletic clients say to me, I told him exactly what you said. Why does he do it when you say it, but not when I say it? That's a tough conversation to navigate.
With my children being fairly young, my oldest is 11, I feel like I'm right in the heart of beginning to learn that sometimes presence and listening is so much more valuable than, let's say, 50-50 back and forth in a conversation. And even, I am well beyond in my development, I hope, beyond the point of saying, well, let me listen to you and then I'll just tell you how I would deal with the situation. My daughter comes home and she has a challenge with some friends at school or whatever it is. I'm well beyond the point of saying, well, you should go and tell her this. But still, I am right in the thick, I feel, of learning constantly that sometimes just listening to the person and allowing them to go through the stages of grow or asking the right question, even if it's not, what's your goal, what's the reality, and so on, is more useful, which is quite tough when you have an employee or you have a child or you have an athlete who you really care about. And you need to allow them to feel the solution or build upon what they already know to come to the solution that maybe you feel like you already see.
I've come to think that true listening, so what does it get called? Empathic listening or active listening, listening so carefully you can demonstrate understanding to the other person's satisfaction, is the most fundamental skill for a leader, for a parent, for a coach. And I think it's the first thing to go when people get stressed, because they stop listening externally and they're listening to that voice going, I know, I can't wait to tell you what I know and tell you what you should be doing.
Yes, I have no doubt that that is true. And I'm going to share one way that I try to demonstrate some of the value of not telling people how to do something. And you'll have to tell me if you think maybe I got this from you, because I'm not sure if I watched one of your videos or maybe it was in your book. I might have gotten it from someone else. I don't know, but I know I didn't come up with this myself. I once was talking to a group of people about the value of active listening and asking questions and really bringing out of the person what they already know. And there was a woman in the room who was maybe 5 feet tall, and I'm 6 feet tall. And being male and female, we also have sort of different body geometries and different weight and all of that. And I don't remember if I used this exact example, but I did something along the lines of saying, well, let's imagine that she's holding a tennis racket. Okay, we're both standing in front of this group. We're both holding a tennis racket. If I tell you, twist your wrist like this or hold it like that, I'm necessarily going to hold the racket differently because my hand is larger and I'm going to feel it differently. If we're walking up or down stairs, I don't know how tall a normal stair is, but let's just say that it's 10 inches. The basics of the way that our bodies move is the same, but I suspect you feel it quite differently when for you, you are raising your foot much higher in proportion to your total body height than I am. And so whether we're talking about doing something physically or we're talking about mental processes, because she has a different background and different experiences and so on, she's going to understand me saying, do it like this from, an outside perspective. She's going to try and think, well, if he's holding the racket like that, what's that supposed to look like in my hand? And less so, she's less likely to think, I understand how that feels. And that to me is an example that I will use periodically to just try and demonstrate how maybe you should start with a question that I came upon because of your work, which is something occurred. And then I say, what did you notice? Now, I don't know if you remember or not, but I might very well have come upon that because of your book, that people physically are just going to, for example, hold a racket differently.
What you're describing to me is, I think of as people have different mental maps. And we tend to assume that our maps are the same. And unless we do some testing, we're not going to find out, is your mental map different to my mental map? And if you just thought of it in terms of a geographic map, if your geographic map shows New York as being much closer to LA than mine, then my instructions aren't going to work very well for you. I used to argue it's like a car rental map. They're not that accurate. They're directionally right.
You reminded me of thought experiment that I encountered not that long ago. And it's probably not useful for us to go down this path, but I just thought it was so interesting. Someone, and I'll look it up and hopefully put it in the show notes if it feels like it's really interesting, that someone at some point made the argument that taller people live just slightly further into the past than shorter people. And the reason being that it takes a certain amount of time for electrical signals to get, along your nerves from your feet up to your head. And yet what we experience is all nerve signals arrive at the same time, basically. And so if it takes, I don't know what the amount of time is, but just to make things simple, it takes 1/10 of a second. I know it's a lot faster than that, but 1/10 of a second for the sensation of me touching my nose to get to my brain. And it takes 1/2 a second to get that sensation from me touching my toe to my brain. But when I do this at the same time, I touch my toe and my nose, I feel them at the same time. And so for me to feel them at the same time, my brain has to wait that 1/2 second until that sensation gets from my toe to my brain before it recognizes my nose was also touched. And you just reminded me of that actually, because I think it's odd, yes, as an example or something to relate to, but I think generally because of neuroscience and so on, we know that there are things like this that are true. There's so much processing going on in your unconscious mind, and there's so little going on in our conscious mind. So depending on what someone has focused on and what they bring up when they relive their memories, or they're analyzing how could I have done better on this math test or whatever it is, then their map is necessarily going to be different from mine. That's really interesting. Thank you. I appreciate that. And you gave me an opportunity to trot out, one of a 1,000 books that I've read in the last few weeks, it seems. So thank you.
We can start on Schrodinger's cat later.
Exactly. Perfect. That would be great. And actually, I've spent the last a little over 6 years working primarily with futurists. So there's a lot of work that we do that seems very intellectual and sometimes woo-woo or navel-gazing. But to go back to something you said earlier about focus, I'm giving a presentation this Friday at an architecture conference in Houston. And the exercise that we'll be going through is a visioning exercise about Houston in the year 2136, which often when you go so far out into the future, things start to seem sci-fi. And well, I'm a very practical person and I have a job to get done today and all of this stuff. So it seems like it's not worthwhile. But one of the reasons that I find vision or a visioning exercise or visualization in sports or any number of fields, but I tend to associate the word visualization with sports. One reason that it's so important is because vision is inspiring and people can see the finish line, whether it's a physical finish line. I'm running a track race and I see it, it's right over there. Or I see in my mind that when my life or my business is successful, it will look like this. It will feel like that. And the thing that I focus on, if I make my vision very clear, becomes so much easier to decide whether or not I am willing to do the work. What is my way forward toward that thing?
I used to ask athletes, are you willing to pay the price for what you want? Because particularly when the athletes, professional athletes are always pushing the envelope. And that means that failure is one step away all the time. That's different to what it's like in most business activities. And they have to be willing to deal with the risk. They have to be willing to pay that price. And they often seem to need reminding of it. Oh yeah, I made that choice.
I appreciate you saying that as well, because, a former colleague of mine, I'm going to look back here behind me to remind myself of the book. He wrote a book that was called Make Choices So You Have Choices. And it's probably clear with the title, but just in case it's not, he was saying what I say to my children very often, which is almost everything is a choice. There are certain things you're going to have to do. If they're my children, they have to brush their teeth before bed. But it's your choice when you do it and how well you do it and whether you do it well enough that I make you go back and do it again. And remembering that you have the power is, I feel, particularly important to not just how you perform, but how you feel about how you perform.
My daughter, she'd go even further. She had some struggles some years ago and went through some experiences. I mean, she was suicidal at one stage. And she went through some experiences, and one of them was particularly transformational for her. Probably she changed more out of this than any other human being I've seen. I asked her, well, what happened? What was of value to you? And she said, I can see now that everything that happens in my life is a function of my choices. So I'm making different choices. And she turned her life around completely as a result of that. She would argue everything is a function of my choices. I can't stop a car hitting me, but I can choose what I make of that experience. And that's one of the key things that we as coaches do for people is we help separate out what actually happens from the meaning we attach to what actually happens. So you have, things happen, and we have thoughts and feelings about the things happening. And from that, we make meaning, and then we take action based on that meaning. I think a lot of what we do in coaching is creating some distance between the event and the meaning, and helping people examine that and examine, are there other ways to interpret what happened? Because the meaning we give it impacts our choices from then on.
I totally agree. And, one, I'm really glad about, it sounds like where your daughter not necessarily ended up, but, the realization that she came to. And also it's beautiful, in my opinion, to go from a place of struggling with something to a place where it sounds like she has a sense of agency.
Yes. She would even tell you, I wouldn't choose to go through what I've gone through, but I don't think I would have the insight I have now without the suffering that I've gone through.
Plenty of people have said it, but one of the things that you said reminds me as well of someone I encountered saying that, the common denominator in all of my struggles, or the good and bad things that have happened to me in my life, the common denominator is me. Now, that's not to say that bad things can't happen to you that were not your choice, but as you're saying in part, how you interpret those and what you carry forward is your choice. If you're in a car wreck and you're upset because you have some injuries that are now going to plague you for the rest of your life, or who knows what the consequences are, for any of us, it will take a certain amount of time to deal with and process those. And it will be different for each person. But after some understandable, let's say, amount of processing, I think a lot of people are going to hope for you that you get to a point where you feel like you're not mentally plagued by, why did this happen to me? Alan, we've talked a bit about some psychology, and we talked a bit about growth. So you've done a lot of coaching. Your organization, at least as I understand it, both coaches people and teaches coaches, but I think you're primarily focused on teaching tools and then facilitating coaches becoming coaches. Is that correct?
We're trying to make it easier for people to be more coach-like. And I would also say, to some degree, we're democratizing coaching. Because the more coach-like everybody can be, the more available it is to everybody. You don't have to constantly go back to the qualified expert. And I'm not against qualified experts, despite the fact that I was thrown out of college. I think there's a place for that. I just think there's so much more we can do by helping everybody become more coach-like.
Well, I really like that one. And so then I guess that is, I don't know if you would describe it as your mission, but that's an aspect. That's what you're trying to accomplish, is to, no matter how you do it, your job to be done, your customers, your clients' job to be done is, I want to be more coach-like.
Yeah, if I had to go, it's interesting hearing you say that. I think my mission, there's a quote I use somewhere in the book, I think at the beginning, that I think the finest service we can give another human being is to make it safe for them to explore their own experience. That's the big turn on for me. Maybe I should have been a therapist, but I don't think it just applies to therapeutic circumstances. I think that's what we're trying to do as coaches, is create an environment. The buzzword these days is a psychologically safe environment in which people can examine the things going on in their minds. Because unless they can do that, how will they get to make a different choice? They won't even recognize the choice they're constantly making. That's where my passion lies. And if we'd had enough beers, then I'd say, well, maybe even that might even contribute to world peace if people could see the pattern going on in their mind.
Do you see coaching evolving in some way in order to become more democratized or harder to do, but maybe more necessary in work or in society more broadly as we experience change so quickly?
You ask people, what is coaching? You get so many different descriptions of it. I like to go to, how do we recognize when coaching is taking place? Well, what you see is a conversation. And it's a structured conversation. And there are things that go on in that conversation that can make it more or less effective. And I think that's also how work gets done. Yeah, so let's put the term coaching aside. If work is about getting from A to B by C, in order to get from A to B by C, you've got to talk to people. Because if you don't, it's going to be very hard to create alignment and know when stuff is done and know what the deadlines are and so on. So if those conversations go well, that's great. And if they don't go well, it slows things down, or sometimes you don't get to B, to where you want to go. So to me, the challenge is to have people recognize that the quality of the conversation impacts everything that happens. I think it's James Clear, maybe, and I apologize if I'm doing, whoever said this is, I may be doing a disservice to, but there's this notion that you don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. Is it James Clear?
I have heard this before, but I forget where it came from.
I'd add to that, I think we fall to the level of our conversations. If we don't do conversations well, then things break down. So for me, the future isn't, it's less about this thing we call coaching that many people, it turns out to be a thing they do on Thursday afternoons when they have their one-to-ones. It's moving from it being a thing that I do to the way I do things. If I'm going to have a conversation, I'm going to get clear what's the goal of the conversation. That would be a service to me, and it would be a service to the other person. I'm going to make sure they really feel understood. That would be a service to both of us. And I'm going to make sure we make a decision about if there's anything next. Which, so now what we're talking about is G and W on the grow model with some stuff with some listening in between. I think that's certainly where my passion is. I don't see, people are going to do all kinds of things with technology. But it's not going to change that basic thing that goes on in coaching, which is a conversation that's safe for action, and that people feel seen and heard, which I think is a bit of the dilemma we've got going on right now with artificial intelligence, is, what can these AI things do for us if I pose them questions? And I think they can do a lot in brainstorming, but I'm not sure they can establish a true sense of connection. And I think that's a part of what happens. I'm big on, as coaches, whether we believe in somebody's ability to learn or not has a huge impact on them. And we know that because the best mentors and coaches we ever had were people that believed in us, and the ones that didn't were awful for us. So our beliefs about people make a huge difference. And I don't know that an AI system can communicate a belief about people. It can mimic a belief. That's different to a true belief. And that's to say nothing of the privacy issues that might go with AI coaching.
Yeah, it certainly seems to me like with AI that there's the potential to uncover certain insights or facilitate work of coaching, organization, brainstorming, any number of things, but that at least as I see it in the next few years, perhaps, and I don't know if I should think that that's the next 2 years or the next 20 years, I have a hard time imagining that someone will feel a deep, meaningful connection with their, you know, device, whatever it is. I'm holding my Apple mouse here, but let's just imagine that that's my friend, you know. I suspect that it will be a long time before that is more than the equivalent of a security blanket or a tool.
Right.
And can become, like I said, a friend, a real friend.
What AI, at least at the moment, can't do is listen to your tone, watch your body language, and when you say, yes, I'm going to do it, say, I don't experience that you're really committed. I'm not saying it'll never get there, but it's certainly not. I've seen some experiments with it, and it's certainly not there right now. And that, I think, is what being coach-like brings to a conversation that AI is going to struggle to do for a while.
That's interesting. Yeah. So somewhat related to that, I guess, you know, I built a proof of concept application that is a sort of a consultant, let's say, but at a very basic level. And essentially what it does is it will listen to a conversation, and then every 3 to maybe 10 minutes, it will pop something up on the screen. So Alan, you and I are talking, let's just say we're in a conference room. We're having some executive strategy discussions or a normal one-on-one, or it could be any number of things. And the computer's listening to us. And now and then something very brief pops up on the screen, and we can choose whether to look at it or not. But the initial version I set up to look for things like, well, if you're going to do that, it seems like here's what you might want to consider. Or it appears, or seems to me, the technology, the quote unquote consultant, it appears there are some unrecognized assumptions in what you're talking about. And I suppose the thing could assume, though I know that it's a little difficult to personify an AI in that way, but for the sake of simplicity, it could assume that your language indicates you're not committed to something, but it's going to base that statement on so much less information than a human will, because as these things get better, of course, there will be improvements in tone, in, I don't know, eye tracking or analyzing video and any number of things. But yeah, it's really interesting you bringing that point up, because this was just a proof of concept to show that we could build a consultant-like technology. But we recognized from the start that it's really more like a tool that a consultant might use in a conversation, or executives might use, because we want to democratize access to high-level consulting. But there are still these unique things that humans do. Humans think analogically. You know, machines are not really very good at saying, well, this is kind of like that other thing. And, you know, an AI now could come up with 1,000 different recipes that might use chocolate and peanut butter and any number of other things. But I think it really takes a human to say, you know, chocolate's good and peanut butter's good. I bet you just chocolate and peanut butter together would be good. To narrow it down to that one thing.
For me, it's just way too early in the game for me to have a lot of trust in it. We might get there, not in my lifetime.
You know, I won't go too far into it, but despite the fact that I read a lot of books, I still will watch shows and movies and all that. And at the time of this recording, there's a movie that has come out that I don't recommend it to a lot of people. I didn't think it was good. It's called Novocaine. And this gentleman, the star of the movie, he has this condition where he can't feel pain, basically. And it's so abundantly obvious at the beginning of the movie that it is, I'm not going to use the right word, but maybe an allegory, or it's a metaphor, perhaps, for children being overprotected, because this main character, he's diagnosed with this condition at some point early in his life. I forget when it was. And he says after that, his parents put him on lockdown. So through the rest of his childhood, he was not allowed to do anything where he could get hurt because he wouldn't feel it. And then he could get a gash on his wrist or ankle and then bleed out because he doesn't notice it. And he doesn't eat solid food because he could bite his tongue off and not notice it. And it was just so obvious. I stopped watching the movie, honestly, after about 20 minutes because I didn't think it was very good. Now, if somebody listens to this and they enjoy the movie, great, whatever, that's fine. But it just seems so obvious to me that it was an examination of what happens to people when they're not allowed to do things that are, let's say, dangerous, but in a safe environment, or, to go to a soccer practice and someone burns you. They go to goal and they score, and it doesn't necessarily feel good, but it's a safe environment because it's practice. It's not the game, or it's not every game. And it's also not the game of life, quote unquote. And you just really brought to mind that, one, there's this movie that's out that I feel like is a commentary on some things that have occurred in society over the last 3-4 decades. But I'm wondering, do you have a perspective on how things are evolving, whether it's how we treat people within work, that there are certain environments where it's not safe to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, you're wrong. And or perhaps parenting, if you want to go that far and comment on protecting children, maybe?
The question we have to ask ourselves, whether it's parenting or at work, is the safety of the individual or others at stake? And if it is, then there's usually only one or two ways to get it done. But outside of that, I think the mistake that parents and leaders make is they don't get clear what their goal is. Is it just to fix the issue, or is it to develop the ability to fix the issue in their child or their colleague? Because depending on that choice of goal, you might take a very different approach. And the knee-jerk response is almost always, I'll just fix it this time and I'll do that developmental thing the next time. They never get to it. Parents are busy, bosses are busy, and then their complaint is, my people never take responsibility. And it's because they never allowed them to.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And I do talk with people about that quite a bit with the sort of consulting that I do. I wouldn't say that I get a lot of opportunities to talk about this, but now and then, in particular, in presenting at conferences or other events, I'll end up talking to someone about, are you CEO? Do you feel like nobody takes initiative, or you have to tell everyone what to do? Well, I don't tend to just challenge them directly like this, but honestly, I'll come around to, it would not surprise me if the reason that you feel like no one takes initiative or responsibility or waits for you to tell them what to do, or why do I have to do everything around here, anything of that nature, is because something has occurred over time, and it's likely slippery slope, where your people got to the point likely because of you, CEO, that they felt like it's not worth trying something until you endorse it.
I've frequently ended up saying to folks that if you've been leading, managing this group for more than 6 months, the way they're behaving is down to you. You can't point the finger at them anymore. It's because of what you're modeling for them. You want them to be different. You do something different first. Don't just point the finger.
That is a challenge that I expect many leaders want. And yet, much like me, with wanting to be an effective parent or soccer coach or spouse, colleague, it's the reality of executing upon that and remembering in the moment, like you're saying, when you're stressed, there are a lot of things that go out the window. Your focus goes out the window. So things have to be simple. And it's difficult for me to remember when I have encountered a challenge with someone. The question, I guess, if I can simplify it in this way or state it in this way, what did I do? How did I contribute to this? Okay, so you have been working in the space for quite a long time. We mentioned AI in this kind of, some of the discussion around AI alludes to this, but what are the big frontiers or questions that still fascinate you about unlocking performance and helping people move toward their goals, whether we want to call it coaching or being a good colleague or whatever else?
It's an interesting question. I'm still blown away by what happens if you ask someone to change what they pay attention to. If you show them where their attention is and help them explore other choices of where they can put their attention. And I still, after how long doing this? 50 years of doing this. I still get as excited watching, say, a 9-year-old do this on a tennis court as I do if it's a CEO having some kind of breakthrough insight or an athlete winning a tournament. And I think the challenge for me is always, how can I shortcut the journey they have to go on in their own experience so they can go, aha, and be committed to a new choice. So maybe as an example, I just spent a couple of days with my oldest client, just maybe not chronologically, but in terms of the length of time, 40 years I worked with this athlete. And we have been through the same conversation probably about 20 times in that 40 years because people forget. Their awareness goes. It's like dust accumulates on their awareness that they no longer see. And we have a conversation and I'm sitting there going, wow, how many times have we talked about this? And he's reacting like, whoa. Well, he actually literally said, have we talked about this before? Well, only 20 or so times. So that fascinates me. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but what can I do to make it stick for longer and shortcut the process? For me, that's the big challenge.
That's interesting. You reminded me of a quote that I bring up quite often. So some people will not be surprised by this, but Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and mathematician, said something to the effect of, and I put it that way because I won't get the quote perfectly, but this is very close. He said, a man will always be more convinced by the ideas which have come into his own mind than by those which have come into the minds of others. And I will often reference that alongside grow because of the idea, which I think is behind, in part, the name of your organization, bringing out of someone what is already on the inside is going to allow them to focus better. It's going to help them have that belief or faith. And I think if I recall correctly, and I actually do have my paperwork from being trained in Grow somewhere around here on the shelves. I think if you have those two things, then it's much easier to have that fire, right? To be motivated to act. So if I try and take that idea, which came into my mind, and tell you, do it like this, you're just much less likely to be convinced that that's a good idea.
The whole inside out thing to me is you can't, until we've learned something about gene splicing, something more, you can't put into people what isn't there. But what you can do, and I'm really passionate about this, you can tap into what I think is the most powerful faculty we have as human beings, and that's our ability to learn. It's no coincidence, I think the developmental psychologists say children learn half of what they learn in their lives by about 5 or 6. So what happens to them at 5 or 6? Hey, we adults get involved. We've taught them there's a right and a wrong, a good and a bad, a should and a shouldn't. And now the kids, instead of just being out there experiencing, are now worried about conforming. They're worrying about being judged. And I think a lot of what we try to do as coaches is help them go back to what I think of as that 1-year-old learner, the one that puts everything in their mouth, explores everything in every way possible, and it doesn't care what anybody else thinks.
Do you have much of a reliance upon behavioral or personality testing?
Yeah, I do. In that, and there's this kind of paradox with them, and I've used lots of different ones. My experience is whichever one anybody goes through first is the one they think is the most valuable. They're all different ways of talking about the same thing to me, but the value of them is less about the actual information in them and much more about the self-awareness that it creates, the willingness to make people pause and go, and reflect on how they show up to themselves and others. And the paradox is that people look at them, they love them. Oh, look, it nailed me, except this bit. I don't agree with this bit. And the weird thing about that for me is the whole point of having these things is to reveal what we're blind to. So if you're going to go, I don't agree with it, therefore it's not valid, you're wasting your time with the rest of it. And I've seen them do that with pretty much all of them. But I think they're powerful tools used the right way. Used wrongly, and I've seen a lot of this, they're used by consultants as a form of importance and power. Look at what I know about you. Look at the insight I can give you. And I'm uncomfortable with that.
I find that when someone has little experience with a behavioral or personality test, or if they're just not in a space in their development at this time, or the amount of analysis that they want to do, that it becomes too easy for me to set in stone, I'm this kind of person. And then to not think that there's work that I can do. So just to give you an example, I happen to really like Big 5 personality assessments. So, what is it? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I think I'm in the 2nd percentile for neuroticism, which, neuroticism in this case is not Freud's neuroticism, so it's not sexual, right? It's essentially anxiety. And I don't know what the literature says, but generally I think that if you're that far out on the bell curve in anything, there are probably some major downsides to that. So it's not just like I'm awesome because I have no anxiety. There could be a read on this that it's I might not take into account certain risks that a reasonable person, quote unquote, really should take into account. And I hope that I'm in a place in my life where when I see my results, I can think to myself, well, in any given situation, I am likely to perform in this way. But there are practices that I can develop, questions that I can ask myself, or any number of things to help me mitigate potential downsides of the way that I am and accentuate strengths as well, mitigate weaknesses and accentuate strengths. But for someone who is just not this kind of person, or they're inexperienced enough, I feel like there's a big risk that they get their test results and they get set in stone.
Yeah.
That's who I am.
I think that all strengths, I mean, even calling them strengths and weaknesses, let's call them traits, want of a better word, can be a strength or a weakness depending on the context. So, and we as a society, we give people labels. They have developmental difficulties. They have learning problems, and we give them a label. And I think that becomes a problem where what we're really saying is, I'm uncomfortable with the way they process the world. That's the bottom line of it. And to make me feel comfortable, I'll make them have a problem.
Yeah, I like that.
And it's not to say, when you look at, say, kids with autism, they're different. Is that good or bad? Well, in terms of norms in society, it's more or less comfortable. We're either willing to deal with it or we're not willing to do it. But there's nothing inherently bad in it or good in it. It's just the way it is. And there's some genius involved and there's some downsides involved.
Are there things that are practices or books or other things that you feel like someone could go out and they could start learning about that thing? Or this is what I would start doing tomorrow if someone is interested in becoming a better coach, colleague, asking the right questions, or any number of other things?
Well, of course, other than my book, big influences on me, particularly many years ago, I read a lot of Zen, which I found really helpful in understanding what we mean by the quiet mind. And athletes talk about as being in the zone. Another big influence on me has been the 4 agreements, because those seem to hold true in pretty much any set of circumstances. They've had that much impact that we've adopted them as values for our company. So those immediately spring to mind. And then I've got like everybody, I've got my bookshelf of books that some people love and some people hate. So I'll mention one of those that has been great for me. It's called Winning Through Enlightenment. Ron Smotherman. I doubt that it's still in print, but there's some secondhand copies available. And that for me is a good challenge to the way we think about how we are in the world. It's an easy read. Well, it's an easy read. It's very short chapters, but it's quite confronting for people to wrestle with.
Alan, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to draw people's attention to or places that you want to point them to?
There's 3 things I could say that coaches do, effective coaches do, but that I think effective people do, whether they think of themselves as coaches or coach-like or not. I think we touched on them earlier. They get clear what their goal is. They're really good at demonstrating understanding, and they decide on a next step, even if the decision is don't do anything. But they make a decision about it so it doesn't occupy shelf space in their brain continually. And I say that because I think most people, most of the time are very unclear what they want from a conversation, whether it's a conversation with themselves or a conversation with someone else. I think most people don't do a very good job of listening, although they like to think that they do. They might do a good job of hearing, but that's different to listening. And I don't think they land on the next step very often. So just doing those 3 things for me, I mean, if you can picture it, if I followed you around the next 2 days, and every time you were in a conversation, before you started, I said, so what do you want? What do you think they want? And then I checked on you were listening. You'd pay a lot more attention to it. And my bet would be it would have an impact on the quality of your conversations.
Maybe that's the inside out AI, right? Is just some reminders. And then the Cliff's Notes version of that can be a resource with you and the coach. Hey, I agree with you. I think one of the things that is talked about in your grow training that is crucial for being a coach is active listening. And that is the number one area that I recognize or feel like I struggle with, is not getting wrapped up in what I think about what the person is saying or what I want to say next or the other thing that I want to be doing instead of talking to you. And thankfully, I do tend to have, I have a reputation amongst my colleagues of being the person at the end of a conversation that will say, okay, so who's going to do what and when are they going to do it? And I got one thing there. I'm working on the rest.
Hey, that puts you ahead of most folks.
Thank you. Hey, hopefully everyone, and I know it's not everyone, but I hope that for everyone, that one aspect of thinking about their own lives is that you think, however I am today, I can choose to work on the thing, and I might get better very slowly or very quickly, but I can choose that. And when I choose that, I can improve. Awesome. Well, this has been my favorite conversation so far, Alan. I was really not just excited when you agreed to talk, but I felt lucky. Grow to me, when I encountered it, I felt like this is a tool or a thing that I've been looking for this, or it would be so useful to me. And then I was able to get certified and go through training with your organization, and your book it's on my bookshelf, which to me, there aren't a lot of them back here because I don't have a lot of 5-star reads. I think last year in all of the books that I read, I bet you out of almost 190, I maybe gave 5 stars on Goodreads to 10 of them. And, I read your book years ago at this point. So not only did I feel lucky for you to say yes, but also I was excited. And now, because I've done a brief recording on Grow, I can go back as soon as we publish this and link to this episode. And I hope that people who listen to that and get interested will come and, hear it right from the horse's mouth, if I can put it that way. So thank you for being here. This has really been great. And I really thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been fun for me too.
Thank you. You're so kind. And I will put it in the show notes, but where can people find you online?
Inside Out Dev. So that's dev.com.
Awesome. Well, I hope that everyone goes there. And thank you again, Alan. I appreciate you being here.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, thank you for listening. I hope you got a lot out of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. And please share it with someone you know who'd appreciate this kind of information. If you want to bring this kind of thinking to your own business, check out mine at inboundandagile.com. We specialize in helping leaders with challenges around marketing, communications, and leadership so they can inspire real action in their people and audiences. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll come back for future episodes.